Great. I came from Mongolia. My parents were sheep herders. And with my friends, I led democratic movement in Mongolia, which ended 70 years rule of communism. And, Senator McCain visited Mongolia 3 times. And actually, his last visit was with the Senator White House. And I took them a little bit for fishing and on the inflated boat in Mongolia. And we saw that next to that, on a river bank, there is a European-looking guy. And Senator McCain said, wow, that's the Kremlin spy there. And he said, you know how Putin likes me. I think that was Kremlin spy and taking photos. I think that cable went to Kremlin very quickly. When Senator McCain visited Mongolia, I think all birds were singing. All those freedom-loving people are talking. All those people who actually hated Senator McCain, also they are talking. When we think about the wall, actually Mongols made to build that Chinese Great Wall. And I know that history remembers Great Wall, but we remember the right. And one thing now in the world stage, when I go, there are 2 main topics. They talk about Trump trip and Chinese expansion. If I identify my country like a freedom-loving pony between bear and dragon. If you live that between bear and dragon, you usually look for the soft places. What is their soft places in China? Actually, they're afraid of their people. They are corrupted. They're afraid of the, freedom. And they treat those ethnic minorities badly. Those Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols. There are more Mongols live in China than in Mongolia. And between them, a small country, Mongolia, democratic, means by example, it's a really big thing. And I think there's many ways to deal with those powers, in a shadow of Putin, in a shadow of Xi Jinping, Kremlin, and Beijing. One time I used my Twitter post, X post, Putin claimed that map showing that Ukraine is not country, we are invading. And I said, I found out old Mongolian map, Mongolian Empire map, which covers whole China and whole Russia. But I'm not claiming for the territories. Mongolia is a peaceful country and free country. But Putin was very angry about me, but that post took 12 million hits. That was really good. One time I visited North Korea, and I asked them to read lecture in North Korea, and they asked me, Mr. President, don't mention democracy, human rights, market economy. I did not mention that. But my title of my lecture was No Dictatorship Lasts Forever. And those South Koreans actually translated into Korean, and they flew that lecture to the North Korean side. And you can resist, in a shadow of those powers. And I really see that you guys, American people, are really great people. What is the strongest thing in America? I think you offer the world freedom. But other countries can offer good wine or fast car or sushi, something. But you offer freedom. That's the really strong thing. In Mongolia, usually, my parents look for weather. When we started democracy, we look for America. What is America doing? What is America saying? You guys like a northern star. When America shares with us, when America cares us, I think you guys more strong. If you invest more in bullets, there will be more bullets against you. If you invest in a people, there will be more people with you. That's really good thing, and you have to care about people when you address those China or Putin. I think if you address Xi Jinping, that address will stay with Xi Jinping and will go with Xi Jinping. When you address those issues, people's desire to live in dignity, in freedom, I think that will stay with the people. And I really believe that every bit of human heart is a call for freedom. You guys, great gift to the world. You like freedom, and you love freedom, you protect freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is Josh Rogin. I'm with Washington Post Intelligence. It's such a pleasure to be here. I was counting in my head, this is my 8th time at the Sedona Forum, including if you count the virtual ones. And I was very struck, actually, by something Senator Sinema said yesterday. She said, for many of you, you were here when Senator McCain would attend. Some of you weren't. And it occurred to me that for those of you who weren't, you haven't heard Senator McCain's stand-up routine that he would give every night at the barbecue. And so thought I'd give a little bit of it to you right now. So the funny thing about the jokes was not that jokes were funny, it was that he would do the same ones over and over again. You can say them with me if you wish. He would say, after the 2008 election, I slept like a baby, sleep for 2 hours, wake up and cry, sleep for 2 hours, wake up and cry. There was the one about 2 inmates on the chow line at the Illinois State Prison. One turns to the other and says, you know, the food was a lot better here when you were governor. And then I think the most famous one is, what's the difference between a lawyer and a catfish? One is a scum-sucking bottom dweller, and the other one's a fish. And now Senator Whitehouse can't use any of those jokes tonight in his speech. And that was everyone's giving a little personal anecdote. I'll give you one little personal anecdote of my time with Senator McCain. I remember when I was covering him as a young reporter, I introduced him to my then fiance, now my wife, Allie, and he stopped, he looked her right in the eye, and he said, there's still time. You don't have to go through with it. That was the kind of guy he was. You know, all of us here have learned from Senator McCain. One of the things that he was very early on was warning about the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the threat that it posed to our prosperity and our freedom and our national security. And now everybody sort of agrees that's kind of the most important thing. And that's what we're here to discuss today. Just a little bit of framing. The Trump administration has launched a trade war and a tariff war against the whole world, but especially against China. Very little planning, very little contingency, very little strategy that we can see, very little consultation with allies. And Xi Jinping is playing hardball. We don't see him rushing to negotiations. We see lots of retaliation, especially against Americans, but also against allies who play along. And the allies are caught in the middle. And so we kind of have the perfect panel to talk about that today. We have Andrew Shearer, the head of national intelligence for Australia. Thank you for coming all this way to be here tonight. We have Liz Economy, Hoover Institution senior fellow, but also former senior official in the Commerce Department. And of course, Chris Johnson, one of the most well-respected former CIA analysts on China, who now runs the China Strategies Group. So let me start with you, Andrew. So you came the farthest, so you get the first question. How is there was an election in Australia. Some of you may have seen a little bit about it in the news. I'm not going to ask you to comment on Australian politics, because I don't think I would get a good answer. But let me ask you from the perspective of Australian national security. How is your community dealing with the fact that the region has been thrown into the middle of a confrontation between the United States and China that we couldn't really have predicted, that is not predictable, and that affects you deeply from the national security perspective? How do you think about it? What are you doing to accommodate it? And where do you see it going? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh. First, let me say it's great to be here at my first Sedona Forum. I did have the opportunity, the privilege to meet Senator McCain a number of times, and he never hid his affection for my country, especially his R&R stops in Australia, and he's remembered very, very fondly down under. Josh, for decades, Australia, I think, was able to enjoy a sense of complacency, a sense that our two oceans, this may sound familiar to some present, provided us with strategic depth and impregnable security. Of course, that's not our reality today. Our reality today is that Australia is very much on the front line of a systemic struggle between the world's two leading powers that is intensifying and, I would argue, accelerating. A world where we're seeing increasing economic fragmentation, I think pretty full tech decoupling, and an escalating conflict in the grey zone. And Australia's felt the manifestations of all of that. So famously, economic coercion. China kept wanting our iron ore, but they were less keen on our excellent wine and delicious crayfish, which meant cheaper wine and crayfish for Australians, so there was an upside. Political interference operations, espionage operations, cyber operations at massive scale, and I listened intently to the earlier discussion today about Fault Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. These are real threats in Australia as they are here. So we have been right at the front line of this, and for Australia, that's a real challenge. We face a situation where our economy is almost perfectly complementary with China's. So even when China was trying to punish us by restricting our exports, our trade to China kept going up. And of course, our long-term strategic partner and ally, the United States, has now embarked on a tariff war with our most important economic partner. So one of the implications of all of that for Australia is that what I call the straddle space, our ability to have, to maximise our economic engagement with China and our security alliance with the United States is under much more pressure. And Australia faces a series of much more difficult choices. We're going to have to increase our national resilience. We're going to have to increase our capabilities, our defence spending, our partnerships with a range of like-minded countries, especially Japan and India, and continue to work our alliance incredibly hard.
Thank you. Before we move on, can you talk a little bit more about where you just left off, which is what I see a lot of, which is that America's partners and allies are turning to each other because honestly, the credibility and reliability of the United States is down. And is that something that has been a change for you, for your government, and how's that going?
So I would say, Josh, I've been an advocate for closer Australian strategic ties with Japan and India and some of our other like-minded countries in the region for about 20 years. So if you look at the closing power gap between the United States and China across the board, but let's just take military power, which I know Admiral Paparo addressed last night, the days when the United States could deter China on its own, could solve these problems on its own, are well and truly over, and we need Japan and we need India to step up. We need as much interoperability with those countries as we can possibly have militarily, but also as much diplomatic coordination, intelligence cooperation. That's absolutely critical to face these threats, and I don't see any alteration in that. It's more and more urgent.
Thank you. Liz, let me turn to you. For those of you who don't know, Liz was the top China advisor to Secretary Raimondo, who spoke earlier today about a lot of the technology issues that we're dealing with at this conference. And I hear often in Washington that a lot of those policies are being continued, and at the same time, some of them are not. But you're the expert. Tell us, how much continuity do you see in terms of the tech competition, whether it be semiconductors or critical minerals or that feed tech production, or even the restriction on import and export of national security sensitive technologies like AI and quantum and pharma and all of that stuff that you guys were working on so hard? How much of it has been carried over? What's going well? Maybe some stuff is going well, and what's not going well?
Okay, thanks, Josh. It's really great to be here with you and with Chris and Andrew, and it's been really inspiring to be here and listening to all the speakers this morning. Really enjoyed it. So I think in terms of the competition remains. I think what's changed in some respects is the content of the policies and how the administrations pursue those policies. So, the Biden administration was very clear. Very early on, it set out, China's the most consequential threat, long-term strategic threat to our economic and national security and our fundamental democratic values. And then, was invest, align, compete. Very catchy, right? Invest was chips in science, and it was Inflation Reduction Act. We've heard about these this morning and into this afternoon. Bipartisan infrastructure law. The tech hubs that were started, I think, in the Commerce Department were really innovative and important. These combined universities and local governments and the private sector. It was all about innovation and manufacturing and training of workforce. It really brought it all together. So that was the invest side. And then there was the align. Well, actually, let me start with the compete, which is where I think there's actually the greatest continuity. And those were all the economic tools that either the Biden administration put in place or expanded. So those included things like tariffs and export controls and in and outbound investment screening, and then the supply chain work that really came, I think, into fruition as a result after COVID. Because all the difficulty that we had in terms of getting the PPE, I think really triggered a new understanding of, I think, and Secretary Raimondo mentioned this, we don't want to be overly dependent on any one single source of supply, whether it's mainland China or it's Taiwan, for things that are critical to our national economic or human security. And so that's a sort of the second pillar was the compete, and then there was the align. And I think Andrew would probably agree that the Biden administration went all out in terms of reaching out to allies and partners, establishing new frameworks, whether it was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I'll be the first to admit it was a poor substitute for CPTPP, but nonetheless, there was an effort to bring our allies to the table to work with them on things like supply chains, on clean energy. I mean, these were important pillars of cooperation. We had the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council. There was the Mineral Security Partnership. There was a whole raft of new institutions that were established, all about trying to ensure that our allies, our closest partners, those with whom we shared fundamental democratic values, that we were all working together. Because one thing that the Biden administration really did appreciate was that there is no way to compete, to Andrew's point, to compete with China unless we're doing it in concert. Export controls don't work, unless you're getting the Japanese and the Dutch and others on board, because others will just fill the holes that we would put in place. I think that for the Trump administration, on the invest side, I guess, what do you see emerging? I mean, it's tariffs, it's supposedly deregulation, and then, I guess, reduced taxes. So it's a different collection of policies that I think are designed to do some of what the Biden administration was also trying to do, which is increase, innovation and advanced manufacturing in the U.S. I think on the compete part, that is, I think, the strongest continuity line of continuity. I think we've seen that they've moved forward, I think, in all the spaces that the Biden administration had put in place and are only intensifying the competition along those lines. I think probably the weakest element of the Trump administration strategy is in the align part. And I think certainly Europe has it worse than Asia. And I think that was true in the first Trump administration as well. At least the more traditional, I would say the more traditional Republicans in the administration who believe in alliances, I'd probably put, I don't know whether I get in trouble for this kind of thing, I don't think so. I'd probably put Secretary of State, Rubio and Secretary of Defense Hegseth and former National Security Advisor Waltz. I'd probably put them in a collection of those people who, very early on were out talking about the importance of our alliances with Asia. Secretary Rubio's first meeting was with the Quad. So I saw a lot of potential continuity out of this administration, at least for Asia, not for Europe. But I'm not sure that they found their footing. I don't feel like they have a very strong position within this administration, and so I'm pretty worried about where that might all go. And then one last point, which is the other area is in the world of international organizations and institutions where we've pulled ourselves out of many of them. And I just want to point out that I think one thing that sometimes we don't miss in these conversations, but we miss in the China conversation, is the extent to which we pulled ourselves out of the UN Human Rights Council. the State Department is rewriting its website on what we consider to be global human rights worthy of protection. So we no longer consider it to be worthy to protect free and fair elections and the right to assemble and the right to free speech. So it's crazy time, and I think that's going to be the biggest difference in some respects. Right, is that we are not, whether or not...
You think that plays into China's hands?
Absolutely, absolutely.
How so?
And, well, let me just finish. And so whether or not we're thinking about AI and promoting our democratic values through AI, we're not doing any political capacity building. We're not doing any support within the United Nations. We're basically taking our marbles and saying we're not playing in this space anymore. And of course, we have our own assault on our democratic institutions. So anyway, not to be on a soapbox, but I think that that's a really important element that we sometimes miss in this China.
No, thank you for bringing it up. And before I move on, let me ask you a specific question about something that you worked on, the CHIPS bill. We heard about it a lot, bipartisan bill. President Trump hates the CHIPS bill. He's always saying how bad it is.
Yeah.
Maybe because it was Biden's bill. Now, there's two ways to look at that. One, what I hear from a lot of Trump people is, well, semiconductor manufacturing isn't actually going as well as we like to believe. The onshoring of these facilities is actually not going to plan. So let's take that money and put it towards investment in leapfrog technologies in the space rather than chips manufacturing. And there'll be a big shift of the money from, that's what the Trump people tell me, that they're going to shift the money from the building the fabs to investing in the future research for leap ahead technologies, whatever they are, maybe contractors that they already know. And that's one way to look at it. So what do you think, since you were so deeply involved in it?
Yeah.
What do you see them doing to the CHIPS bill? Are any of their criticisms valid in the sense that maybe some of these manufacturing projects haven't gone to plan, if we're being honest?
So I think, look, CHIPS was $39 billion for the construction of the fabs and another $13 billion for R&D. I mean, it's pennies compared to what China has been investing over the past decade in semiconductors. So, and chips, what a leapfrog technology. I mean, chips are fundamental to all technologies of the future. I don't even know what that means, leapfrog technologies.
It means focusing on software, other things that are not actually building chips in a factory that may...
How does that square with this entire...
I'm not defending it, I'm just saying...
Anyway,
I mean,
okay,
it's not my plan.
sorry, it's not your
Don't
plan.
blame me.
But let me just say,
I'm just the messenger.
We put in $52 billion, we got, 10 to 1, 10x on that investment from the private sector. And it's true that some of it maybe is not moving as quickly as we would have hoped, but let me point out two facts. Most of the companies haven't gotten their money yet from the US government, and when they're calling now, all of the staff are saying it's above my pay grade, and so it's unclear what Secretary Lutnick is doing. Apparently it's kind of, just episodic. One company may get some money, other big companies are not getting the money. It's also clear that, and TSMC made this clear, we don't have all the talent that they need, right? And that goes back to that workforce training and bringing in foreign talent. And so there's a whole sort of cycle, a whole sort of universe of things that need to come together to make all of this work. And the question is, do you just junk it in favor of tariffs, which is what the president actually has said will bring all the semiconductor manufacturing back? Or do you think about how do you make this work? And everything's in place to make it work. I think there's enormous excitement in places where it has started up, like in Arizona. So to me, it generates everything. It's a virtuous cycle.
Thank you.
We'll have to wait to see.
Chris, sorry to keep you waiting so long.
Okay. I didn't know I was going to need popcorn for this thing. So.
Take us inside the mind of Xi Jinping.
Sure.
Tell us everything that he's thinking right now.
I wish I knew.
And specifically, tell us from what you see of his reaction to Trump's tariff and technology actions.
Yeah.
What do you think his strategy is? And is he in, there's two ways it could go. We could have a climb down like we heard earlier, and Trump could just fold, and they make a quick deal, and we go basically back to where we were, and everybody declares victory. We pretend that didn't happen. Or we could be in for a protracted economic war that neither side feels they can back down.
Right.
Which one do you think is going to happen, and where do you think that that Beijing is in terms of those calculations?
Well, let's start with Xi Jinping. My sense is in terms of how he's reacting so far, he's got obviously a tactical component and a strategic one. I think tactically, he's looking to avoid what he assesses were several mistakes he made when Trump was around the first time. And in my mind, those were basically three. The first was to come to the United States first. The second was to agree to go to Mar-a-Lago rather than have a formal summit in Washington. And I think the third then was to host Trump in Beijing and give him a state visit plus, only for Trump to go home and launch the trade war some number of weeks later. So I think in terms of preserving face, which obviously is very important, and we see that in some of the things they're telling us they want in a negotiation, that the Trump administration needs to show more respect for Xi Jinping and for the Chinese people. So I think that's the tactical piece. The strategic piece in my mind is very simple, which is Xi Jinping is trying to get Trump to acknowledge that he personally and the Chinese are strong, and that the judgment that he and his team have made, which is that the economy with its sort of anemic recovery is so vulnerable that it will fall over if you blow on them. And I think it's fair to say President Trump took that to the bank, went with a very shock and awe, there was something about javelin throwing earlier this morning. The Chinese, I think, may think it's more like seppuku than javelin throwing. But I think what was interesting in this sense is that Xi Jinping is getting there on this, and we're starting to see that paying dividends. In terms of how he wants to going forward, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about this concept of like a reverse Nixon or a reverse Kissinger. The shorthand of that is we work closely with Russia.
Explain what the reverse Kissinger is.
Yeah, sure. So basically it's the idea that the U.S. now cozies up to Russia to isolate China in the way that we worked with the Chinese in the 70s to isolate Russia.
And you're skeptical that that could work?
I'm very skeptical that it could work, as in it's a ridiculous suggestion. But,
Tell us how you really feel.
Yeah. So for Xi Jinping, I think he's working on his own reverse, which is what I'm calling the reverse Roy Cohn, which is a sort of way of looking at things. Roy Cohn was Trump's lawyer. And someone who had a huge influence on him, and he had a certain set of principles that Trump learned from him. And I think we see Xi Jinping employing 5 of those in this competition. The first is always attack, never defend. And I think it's been easy to watch. Trump has made so much noise with the 90-day tariffs, or the tariffs on, the reciprocal tariffs, 90-day pause, blow up China, up, down, all over the place, Canada, Mexico. We've been losing in the picture. The Chinese are being more aggressive this time in their responses. They're responding faster than they did previously. And I think it's another of these lessons they learned from Trump Trade War I, which was, turns out we cannot go toe-to-toe with the Americans on tariffs because we very rapidly run out of stuff to tariff because of the tariff imbalance between our two countries. So we need asymmetrical responses. And they've developed over the last 6 years or so what I call their coercive retaliatory toolkit. And it's the lawfare things like their anti-foreign sanctions law, unreliable entity list, these sort of things. It is the rare earths and critical minerals, obviously, these sort of things. And we've seen them at each stage of this tariff war so far use those things and use them directly and building to be able to escalate rapidly, if they need to. And I found it quite striking, their first few responses after the fentanyl tariffs, the response was sort of like, oh, look at them, look how weakly they're responding. I didn't see it that way at all. To me, they were laying the groundwork to go for it. I think the second one is obviously accuse your accuser and never admit that you're wrong. And in this case, we see them issuing a series of these white papers. The first one was on fentanyl, the second one on the Phase 1 trade agreement, where in both cases China said, we've done an outstanding job in all of these things. What are you complaining about? And my sense is obviously when I talk to Chinese contacts, they'll say, look, we understand this is for the domestic audience. We're not trying to, we don't think the foreigners are going to change their mind, but it's designed to flood the zone with a lot of noise to counter Trump's, truthing and constant commentary. And it's also, I think, designed to convince the Chinese public that the cause is righteous and therefore whatever pain they're going to have to suffer is worth it. The third one I would say is frame the narrative. And in my mind, Xi Jinping has a domestic narrative and a foreign one. The domestic one is, his brand, if we want to call it that, is about being unflappable and infallible. And so what we're seeing from them in the domestic narrative is the Politburo saw all this coming in all its wisdom, and they've planned it out all along at each subsequent meeting from last September. We've been ready for this. That's wonderful, but I think that was true up to 60%. What they did not foresee was 145%, and that's a whole separate ballgame. The foreign narrative is also simple, which is China is the true defender of the multilateral trade system, and the U.S. is the destroyer of the same. So I think that's pretty clear. The fourth one I would highlight is always double down. And for Xi Jinping, I think that's very simply self-sufficiency, building a fortress economy, industrial upgrading, pursuing IT, all the things that we're seeing from them on the regular basis, and in particular, dual circulation, right, which is embedding the external circulation of dual circulation is embedding global supply chains deeper into China, especially in these core technologies and advanced manufacturing. And then the fifth one I would just highlight is, of course, winning is everything. And I think for Xi Jinping, it comes down very simply to, I just need to last a few minutes longer than he can. And his dialectical material mind is telling him that the capitalists who control the US president will get to him before my equivalents get to me. And so far, I think we're seeing signs of that. And we can talk about perhaps later where Xi Jinping is wrong in these 5 strategies that he's pursuing.
Okay, well, let's do that now. Where is his?
Well, to put it very quickly, I think one thing is obvious. He knows in his mind that Trump is dealing with a different Xi Jinping than he was in the original trade war. Xi Jinping is even stronger now. He's more in control, more dominant in the system. He was in control then, but he was still trying to consolidate his hold over the security services in particular at that time. But sometimes he forgets he's dealing with a different Donald Trump, somebody who, as we heard earlier today, did not have the sort of normies, I believe they were called, people who could put some guardrails around Trump and so on. So I think the problem in the Chinese strategy, which is logical on its face, play hard to get, deny Trump the ability to have one-off concessions, TikTok, C.K. Hutchinson, fentanyl cooperation, in the hopes of wrapping it all up into a larger deal. But the risk is they wait too long. And they miss the tipping point at which, for Trump, the value of those various things goes to zero. And I think he's already getting there, maybe on TikTok. He could very easily say, look, I tried hard, they're not playing ball, forget it. And so I think if Xi Jinping is not careful, we could find ourselves in that situation. And to your question about where are we headed and so on and so forth, my view is we're going to immediately or pretty soon get to what I'm calling phony de-escalation, which is they're going to agree to cut tariffs substantially, maybe to like 50%. Markets will like that at first. Then they'll quickly realize it's still trade prohibitive when you add on the existing MFN tariffs, the upcoming 232, 301, et cetera.
Steel and aluminum and all that stuff. So we'll settle out to a very bad equilibrium that will be bad for both sides, and both sides will declare victory.
Until maybe it drops off dramatically again. I mean, my concern is that we all rejoiced when the two sides said, okay, we both agree these tariffs are at stupid levels. We're not going to do that anymore. That's good. We don't want more tariffs. The problem is all that's left if you want to escalate or provoke is asymmetric responses. In my mind, the asymmetric ones is how we have a rapid deceleration in the relationship.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack there. Andrew, I see you nodding, and you are the leader of an intelligence community. It's a Five Eyes partner. Was everything that Chris said correct? And do you think, what is your take on, does Xi Jinping intend to stick it out for the long fight and just wait for Trump to crumble under his capitalist masters, or is he under pressure to make a deal, and eventually they'll make a deal, even if it's a bad one for both sides?
So I think there'll be a deal like Chris outlined, but it won't be a grand bargain. It'll be a sort of petite bargain. And it'll be bad for the world, right? It'll be lower growth. It'll be higher inflation. There'll be more supply chain disruption, and there'll be more vulnerability to future financial shocks. I think that's what good looks like here. I think that's our new reality.
That's the best case scenario.
Best case scenario. And for a country like Australia that depends on free movement of goods and people and capital, it's a much less desirable world. We're not a European country. We're not part of a natural trade bloc. This is a highly suboptimal world for Australia. It'll be bad for our economic growth. It'll be bad for productivity. It sucks.
That's a technical term.
The Prime Minister always says, so have you got any good news for me? And usually I don't, but there are some opportunities here. And going back to the earlier discussion, none of them involve onshoring or kind of solve this on our own. I'll start with the defence industrial base. We all know that the West is being completely out produced by the axis of whatever you like to call them. I just call them the Axis powers. That seems to get their attention. We need to integrate our defence industrial base and get very serious. We basically need to mobilise our defence industry across the West, starting with the United States. And that means a whole lot of things to break down some pretty silly barriers we've all put in place over the last few decades. There's been progress on that. Cooperating in advanced technology where we all bring different strengths, and again, there's been some good work. Key to both of those, of course, is AUKUS. People would be surprised if I didn't put in a plug for AUKUS here. Both Pillar 1, which I don't know if Admiral Paparo got to talk about it last night, but key to maintaining deterrence, especially in that critical undersea domain. But Pillar 2 with all the advanced technology areas is critical. We need to think much harder about trusted capital, how we can greenlight American, Canadian, New Zealand. I don't think they have a lot, but all of that capital and get it into parts of our economy where we need to know that the capital is trustworthy, and I'm including critical infrastructure right at the heart of that, but advanced technology also I think is central. And then critical minerals. Australia is a critical mineral superpower, and we've got a lot of them. We're selling a lot of them to China, frankly, right now. Why are we doing that? Because China's been so successful in distorting those markets, and we've all been sitting there waiting for the market to solve the problem. And as a result, we don't have a processing industry in Australia. We've got a group of countries, especially the United States, that are increasingly desperate for these. We know that this is right at the top of Xi's priority list as well. And we need to find the wit and the wherewithal to get together and build a serious agreement among like-minded countries that brings capital into this. We need to generate dependable long-term demand for these minerals. And guess what? You can't do it all in the United States because God in his wisdom chose to sprinkle these things around the globe. He sprinkled a lot in Australia. But without that commitment and that framework where we work together on that problem, I don't think we'll solve it. But I think the pieces are there.
Excellent, a lot there. Good thing is we have a critical minerals deal with Ukraine. Bad thing, Ukraine doesn't have critical minerals. But, we're going to go to questions. So start thinking of them. Last question to Liz from me is, who has the cards? You study the Chinese economy. I hear two theories. One is that it's on the brink of collapse at all times, and if we just lean on them, it's going to tip over. And then the other one is they could suffer pain endlessly, and there's nothing we can do about it, so fighting a war of attrition economically with China's madness. Which one of those do you subscribe to based on your analysis of the Chinese economy and the Chinese government's position in that economy, or is it something in between?
Yeah, I think it's something in between. I think for sure over the past 3 years they've been in a economic slowdown. The economy's been struggling. It's the property sector. It's the increasing debt to GDP, which now exceeds that of the United States. It's the weak consumption sector. I mean, there's nothing new here. These are problems that they've had for a decade, but they're kind of all coming home to roost, and COVID really, I think, brought them into sharp relief. Having said that, it's important not to mirror image. And I remember back in Washington in last August, there was a narrative that was coming around about peak China, and that that China had reached this peak, and now we're starting to see it retrench on the global stage, right? That somehow that its economic challenges were leading it to take a step back globally, and it was clearly not the case. There was no evidence to support that whatsoever. But I think it's because we thought this is what would happen if we were in this situation. But I think it's important to recognize that China has an enormous repressive apparatus. It manages to keep 600 million people living on $150 a month or less. At the same time as it is investing, I don't know how many times, as much money as we are in a whole array of technologies. And so everything that you see in that Made in China 2025, those 10 critical cutting edge technologies that include things like semiconductors and medical devices and new materials, it started with, EVs and batteries. All of that, that same pattern of China, focusing manufacturing at home, putting in sort of non-tariff barriers to entry for foreign companies, and then becoming globally dominant, that's the plan for all of those industries. So what we've seen in those two, we should expect to see across a whole array of future industries. Let me just say on the tariff war and who holds the, I think there was a miscalculation on the part of the Trump administration that because the trade deficit, because they export so much more to us than we do to them, that somehow, we held the cards. But I think it missed the point that we have much more sole source or near sole source dependency on China than they do on us. So for something like 30% of the goods that we import, we have a 70% dependence or more, meaning we're not sourcing from anywhere else. So I think, we see that with the critical minerals and the rare earth elements, and they become very, very sophisticated about using all those tools that Chris outlined. I think now, though, I'll offer maybe a somewhat different perspective than we've heard. I do think the two sides are coming to the table. I think President Trump blinked 2 weeks ago when he said, of course, we never planned for these tariffs to stay at this level. Of course, they're going to come down. Treasury Secretary Bessent said the same thing. The Chinese then began to have a little bit of debate. The Ministry of Commerce had come out and said, we're not sitting down at the table with you unless you take all the tariffs off. That was the initial negotiating position. Now they're not saying that anymore. They demoted sorry, this is a little in the weeds, but maybe to make my case. They demoted the Vice Minister of Commerce, who's very hard line, Wang Shouwen. So he's no longer, playing in that space. And there was a debate in the Chinese media where you started to see articles saying, President Trump blinked. Let's take the win. It's an olive branch. Let's go back to the negotiating table. At the same time, you maybe saw this, Chris, there was a big article on protracted war, which referenced Mao Zedong's 1953 book, which basically said, don't even think about talking about going back to the negotiating table. We're in this for the long haul, hunker down, guerrilla warfare, we're all in. So there's clearly been this debate now that's emerged within China.
Fascinating.
Seems to me that they're indicating, I think if you look now at the reporting, they're indicating they're preparing to come to the table. So I don't know where it lands, but I think that's what's happening.
Very, very interesting. Okay, please raise your hand and tell us who you are, where you're from, and if you're going to make
Don't call on him.
A statement, put it in the form of a question.
There must be somebody else out there with a hand.
Matt. Wait for the mic, please. Sorry. Just be 1 second.
I'm Matt Spence from ASU. My question is sort of two parts. So in the technological competition all of you have spoken about, what are the areas that the U.S. is so far behind China, it's not worth really competing or not putting our cards on the table there? And where are the areas that we can make most of an impact starting from right now?
Good question. Who wants to take that first? Liz?
Okay,
Brief answers, because we're running.
Okay, good. I'm not a fan of saying we shouldn't compete, because the easy area would be to say EVs and batteries, where we've clearly fallen really far behind. I'd rather adopt a Chinese strategy. We could talk more about that, but since you want a brief answer, that's my answer. I don't believe in not competing.
Chris?
I would just say that I worry less about the technology, although it does have an implication. I worry more about some of the defense systems where they're currently outstripping us and have capabilities that we do not currently.
Andrew?
Back Liz in, we need to compete pretty much everywhere, not building solar cells though, ourselves maybe. And AI is the one to, as per some great conversation earlier today.
We could do a whole panel on that. So just to close, to review, Xi Jinping is acting like Roy Cohn. The best outcome in the trade war is that it sucks. And this is going to get worse before it gets better. And if you want to end on a note of optimism, I might throw in one last John McCain quote, a famous quote he had on China. He would always quote Mao Zedong, and he would say, as Mao said, it's always darkest before it goes completely black. And what was funny about that is Mao never said that. And McCain knew Mao never said that. He wouldn't quote Mao Zedong, but he would love to misquote Mao Zedong. But the lesson there is that the future is not written. If we all attack these problems together, there are good outcomes that can come. Thank you for helping us understand it. Please give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you so much.